Hey everyone, I'm Vince. Welcome. Today I want to introduce you to a book I think you should know about called Human Communication as Narration by Walter Fisher. This is actually a book that I ordered on accident. I got confused with another book and I didn't find out until I had started reading this one that I was confused. But I continued with the book. I pressed on, and it's probably the book that changed my life the most in the way that I look at and understand the world. So I'm going to try to summarize it for you in less than 5 minutes, and maybe it'll have the same impact on you. All right, here we go. Walter Fisher wants to set up a whole new way in which we talk about and access truth. The first part of the book sets up a lot of background and has a lot of technical jargon, and it may very well be the best thing that's ever been written. If you're in the field, read it, let me know. I don't know. I had a hard time dredging my way through it, but again, remember, I bought the book on accident, and I'm not in the field of communication. Basically, after going through the history of how we as humans have communicated with one another ever since we started communicating, and all the different ways that we communicate, like poetry and philosophy and storytelling and technical language, we got to this place as humanity where technical language ruled over the others, especially when talking about truth. To find truth about something, we want to make sure our language is as technical or as analytical as possible. And all communication is only good for talking about truth when it's used to somehow bolster analytical language, like using metaphor is only good insofar as it makes clear a technical truth claim. Think of it like this. If you and a friend are having a debate, who wins? The person who refers to a poem and appeals to emotion, or the one who makes the logical argument? Well, I think that we would say that a lot of people like the appeals to emotion, but the thing that gets published is the actual logical argument. So we value that. Fisher says that this is because of our overarching view of humans as rational creatures. He calls this the rational paradigm. So being rational is the highest level of communication. We develop experts who excel in their respective fields because they can use technical language and what we might call facts better than any others in their field. So again, the way to win an argument is to make the better argument, which means to be able to better use technical language and facts to bolster your claim. Well, what's the problem with this? You and I can probably see the problem with this even a lot more clearly than Fisher could in the 80s, since we live in this post-truth era. The problem is this is just not how it works. People aren't persuaded by logic. No one agrees on facts. Experts are easily disagreed with by saying something like, well, you're just saying that because you're being paid to say that. And the truth is, a lot of experts are just saying that because they're being paid to say that. What Fisher says is that actually, at our core, human beings are not rational. Instead, we are storytellers. And this doesn't just mean that we love to tell stories and that we can understand stories, although that's partly is, what it means. It means that we tell stories to make sense of our lives. In fact, our lives are a story that we tell as a storyteller. We are the main character in our own story. He calls this the narrative paradigm. When evaluating a story, we look for two things: narrative coherence, this is how we evaluate the inner workings of a story, and narrative fidelity. This is how we incorporate stuff into our story. So, narrative coherence, does everything in the story fit together? Does the story flow? Is it consistent or plausible? Now, when we read a story in a book, we can evaluate, we can say something like, oh, that's so fake, or the author contradicts himself or herself right here or right there. But when telling our own story, we know that what we've experienced has happened, so we know that it fits together, we know that it's consistent, and even if it isn't, or it doesn't make sense to us, we make it make sense. We have to see our stories flowing and coherent, and we have to find meaning in them. So for instance, if something random happens that changes our lives, we might think, that happened for a reason. Or we might have to forget things or remember things incorrectly in order to save our own mental health. Now, the second is narrative fidelity. That's what we look for in a story. Is the story true to itself? Would this character really have done this or that? Inside of our own stories, we ask this question about the world in order to evaluate it. Does this thing fit into my personal narrative? So for instance, when a politician says something, I evaluate whether I believe him or her based on my own experiences. Further, think of when we hear conflicting data, like an economic report comes out. We either say something like, yes, this proves that my candidate is doing great, or If it's not very good, then we'll say, oh, the other party, they did a terrible job, and now my man or woman is trying as best they can with the mess they inherited. But one way or the other, we seek to preserve our hero status in the way that we think. So to be clear here, Fisher is not talking about truth and what actually happens. Fisher is talking about how we access truth. He's saying that to get to truth, we don't rely on logic, but on all forms of communication. So he's really seeking to put all forms of communication on equal ground to talk about or access truth. All right, if you'd like to stick around, I'll talk more about that. But I think that's a pretty good summary of this book, and hopefully under 5 minutes. We'll see. Before concluding this video, I wanted to point out a few things. One is this idea of how we access truth through our personal narratives. So let's say there's a situation where we can't know the truth, we can't know what really happened, but there's two people that are in an argument and we can't tell who's right. We don't actually analyze data to form our conclusions. Instead, we look for narrative fidelity. Let's say one is a woman and one is a police officer, and the woman is claiming police brutality. Right. So if you're a woman who has experienced police brutality, then that fits into your narrative, and before you even look for any of the evidence, you already are going to side with her. However, if you are a police officer, or you have police officers in your family, or maybe you were really helped by a police officer one time, then you are automatically side with the police officer. And then once we amass evidence, well, that evidence can just further support what we already think. So let's say the woman emerges with a bloody nose, and then if you're the woman, you start feeling bad. You go, oh my gosh, this woman, she was brutalized by a police officer just like I was one time. But then the police officer says, no, she came hit me first, or even though he says, hey, she punched herself, right? And if you are a police officer, or again you're very much tied to that, or you just have this overall identity of law and order and a high respect for police officers, then you already side with that. And you say, yes, he's probably telling the truth. So even the way that we evaluate evidence is with this whole narrative fidelity thing. How are we going to, so and the point is that we can't really know the truth. I mean you can set up a situation where it very much, everything points to the police officer is in the right here, the woman is in the wrong. It goes to court, and then that's what they find out. Like, there's absolutely no getting around it. But that's just not how real life is, right? That even if so, this woman is in the right, and it could be that in the end, this woman very much was in the right, or vice versa, right? Another thing that I think is interesting about this is something that Fisher does not really talk about, but I think it's a neat consequence, and it's this notion that I mentioned above about putting all forms of communication on equal footing for accessing or talking about truth. We can imagine the situation with a woman and man like a lot differently. Let's say this woman is Hispanic and doesn't speak any English. So she has a very hard time speaking up for herself and has a chance of being railroaded by the system. And we could say, well, what if she's uneducated or illiterate even? So in this situation, the officer is definitely the expert, and his use of technical language. That's the language that he uses in his case to lay everything out, and also his use of English and his ability to put data together. It's just overwhelming, right? That it's on her side, and so Fisher's narrative paradigm lifts her up. It puts her on the same level as him, insofar as listening to both of them can help us discover what actually happened, not just the one who speaks the language or who's in the majority or who puts their data together the best. See, what the narrative paradigm does is it validates the marginalized, or those who aren't generally viewed as though they're as important as others, or they're possibly even generally overlooked or viewed as untrustworthy. So I think that's a neat consequence of this narrative way of looking at reality. A third implication is that this narrative paradigm is important on a spiritual level when talking about ultimate truth or about God. Like, we have a way of valuing the learned theologian or the philosopher as though they have better access to ultimate truth. But I think what the narrative paradigm points out is that we are all humans and have the same access to God or to ultimate truths. The uneducated poor black man in the ghetto has just as much access to God as the learned theologian at the university. In fact, James Cone, in his book, God of the Oppressed, another book I summarize on my channel, would argue that they have even more. But that's another discussion. Look for that summary on my channel. That's a very interesting book. I also want to point out that the narrative paradigm has huge implications for a lot of other fields. One that I was just introduced to was narrative psychology, and I think my next book's going to come from that field somewhere, so if anyone watching this video has a recommendation, let me know. But in narrative psychology, what's important is to work with a person to redefine their own story in order to make sense of whatever is causing the neurosis. So do you see the difference there? Instead of trying to find something logically in their lives and fix it, what we're doing is we're trying to fix the story, to incorporate it, or to redefine yourself. And finally, there's an implication here in just loving one another and understanding each other and getting along with people. People don't disagree with you because they're stupid, right? But most of the time, it's because they come from a different place in life with different experiences. They have a different narrative. And we need to be able to listen to one another and put ourselves in their shoes to truly understand each other. All right, that's my video on human communication as narration. Hit the like button, and I don't know what else I'm supposed to say.